There we go. So many of you may have heard of nature-based climate solutions for mitigating climate change and the decline in biodiversity. However, many of you do not have forests or wetlands or fields. So how can you contribute, and will your efforts have impact? Tonight's webinar is about how meaningful impact begins with individuals whose collective behaviors create change. It starts with small personal actions like planting native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers in your garden that feed native species and sustain the food web. So Lana Doss, our speaker tonight, is the owner of The Fine Gardener, which focuses on the use of native plants in the garden. Her methods are nature-based climate solutions. They apply whether you live in the city, the suburbs, or a large rural area. Friends of the Carp Hills thank Lana for offering her time and expertise tonight to help others on the path to a healthier garden and a healthier planet. Over to you, Lana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. And I want to thank the Carp Hills as well for giving me this platform to share about some things that I'm really excited about. And I will tell you just a little bit more about me. So the majority of my career has been spent in retail management, largely for garden centers. And I made a change about 6 years ago to work for myself as a professional gardener. During the winter, I teach plant health and pest management at Algonquin College in the horticultural apprenticeship program. And with my company, The Fine Gardener, I offer a wide range of horticultural services. One of my favorite services now, though, is to help homeowners and gardeners learn to make the shift to more sustainable gardening practices in their own spaces. So during this talk, I'm going to cover why it's important to start looking at our private spaces in a different way. I'm going to cover some terminology that you may have been exposed to when if you've been reading or hearing talks similar to this. Terminology like native plants, non-native, exotic, naturalized, nativars, and invasive. These are usually things that we come across, and I'm just going to touch on them really briefly so that you have an idea of what I'm referring to. We're going to cover best practices when gardening for wildlife. I will give you also a few examples of native plants, especially ones that I like to use in gardens that can replace landscape plants, ornamental landscape plants. I also have quite a few resources at the end. Janet's going to put them in the chat. They'll be in my slides, but she'll also add it to the chat a little later because I'm going to cover a lot of materials tonight, but I'm probably going to cover them very quickly. So if this is the information that you are finding that you would like to learn more about, there are tons of resources, and I will share some of those with you. And as Janet mentioned earlier, I'll save some time at the end for your questions, and I'll also give you my contact information again so that you can reach out to me if you don't get your question answered tonight. So one thing that I was curious about, I'm wondering where you are coming to us from tonight, whether you live in an urban area, suburban, or rural. So Janet's going to put a poll up there for you to fill in if you would like. That would be awesome. Just a curiosity, and then I have another one at the end. I have a couple of questions. So if you can humor me and fill those in, that would be great. So I've told you that I spent my career in horticulture. I've been in this industry for probably about 30 years. And the dilemma has been that we've wanted our gardens to be pretty organized and controlled. And the perception has been that native plants or wildflowers are messy, and they can't be as pretty and organized and tame as some of our exotic plants that we have imported from around the world. And garden centers have sold what's been in demand. So largely what's been in demand for the last few decades for sure have been exotic plants that have been brought to us from other places. And part of the attraction of exotic plants is actually that nothing will eat them. I know that's a generalization, but for the most part, many insects do not eat exotic plants, and we'll get into why. So I'm actually looking at changing things, and the industry is changing things that, before we didn't want to see holes in our leaves, and now we do, and we want to because we know it's part of the ecosystem and being a contributing member of the ecosystem if something is eating it. So why it's important to look at our private spaces in a different way. If again, you've been interested in this type of material, you've definitely heard of Dr. Doug Tallamy. He's written a couple of really awesome books on this kind of content, and he's been really leading the charge in North America to start looking at things a different way. And I'm going to just share a quote by him. I'm going to move my screen over first. So much of our land is taken up by roads, buildings, lawns, parking lots, croplands, but not native plants. And there's a loss of habitat to our important native wildlife, and they need native plants and trees to survive. And without these native species, our whole food web will collapse. They end up trying to survive in these tiny fragments, which are too far away from other isolated fragments for them to reach. And his premise is that if we all planted native plants and trees, it would create an ecological network where our native wildlife will thrive. And why native plants? Well, first of all, I'll tell you that native plants are those which occur naturally in the area where they've evolved. And they also evolved alongside of insects from that area. So the insects use these plants as food, and then they in turn become food for larger wildlife. Native plants serve as important host plants for numerous insects. Plus, native plants also have a higher nutritional content than native plants. So in that quote, I mentioned how native insects and birds, migrating butterflies, they have to go far to get to other parcels of native plants. This is a picture right here that I actually took from the Carp Hills website of the Carp Hills. And it shows exactly what he's talking about. You can see how in the middle, you have this area of water. It's a very unique ecosystem, lots of biodiversity, but completely surrounding it are pristine farmlands, crops, houses, suburbs, that type of thing. This type of thing. So if we were to look at our spaces, and if we were to look at a space like this, which is absolutely gorgeous, it is actually an award-winning design in Ontario, we can tell that this doesn't add much to help those migrating insects and other critters. It's basically, it's concrete, other than maybe a couple of petunias that some butterflies might be able to have some nectar in. It's really largely not a contributing member of its ecosystem. So what do you think about this as a better option? Okay, so a lawn. So we have a lawn here, which is going to definitely sequester some carbon as opposed to concrete. There is soil, so there's going to be some water penetration. It won't directly run off into the floodplains. And there's going to be some living organisms. There's going to be some critters in the soil. There's going to be worms. There's going to be some small insects, some microorganisms. But if we take it a step further and look at a couple of more additions that could make that an even better situation for wildlife. So this particular garden here, a couple of things that it has, which would be an improvement over the last two slides. There are different flowering perennials here that flower at different times a year, offering some nectar to some butterflies and pollinators throughout the year. There's also the addition of some bushes and trees. So we're beginning to see some components of shelter for birds and for other wildlife. People that are proponents of native planting would suggest that this would be the best scenario in our good, better, best of outside space use. And the reason why it would be one of the better or best scenarios is there's a couple of things happening in here. So first of all, we've got quite a few different types of native flowering plants, which not only offer nectar and pollen, but a lot of caterpillars and other insects will eat some of these leaves. We've got milkweed, for example, where monarch caterpillars are going to use those as well before they pupate and then start their migratory path. We have a source of water. That's one thing that we need for a wildlife habitat. And in the background, you can also see that there is quite a bit of brush and bush and providing shelter for wildlife. And when plants are planted this thick, it does a lot of other things as well. And I'll kind of get into that a little further down. But one of the best things is that it provides shelter. Like I can picture toads living in here and chipmunks and other kinds of critters. So in the past, we've asked one thing of our gardens, that they be pretty. And now they have to support life, sequester carbon, feed pollinators, and manage water. But that's easily done. So this message of change is a very positive one. As gardeners and owners of outside spaces, we have a huge opportunity to support more biodiversity in our spaces. And it's very empowering to know that we have the ability to grow food for migrating creatures, as well as those which are localized in fragmented pockets, such as the carp hills. And I can tell you as well, I've talked to a lot of other people in the horticultural industry, and we've been very excited about the interest that we've been seeing over the last couple of years. And one of the challenges for the industry right now, though, is to keep up with the demand. Landscape plants take a couple of years to grow, and we've seen a real surge in growing our own food as well as native plants, and especially since the pandemic, but it does take a little time. So I do know of some people who are giving out free native seeds as well as seedlings. I have their link in the attached resources, and I'll tell them a little bit about that. And plus, I know a lot more people who are growing their own native plants. So like I said, some to give away and some to sell. So that's really encouraging to see. So I mentioned that I'd get into some terminology. So this is what we're actually talking about. So native versus non-native. So native plants, as I referred to, they are plants that occur naturally in the area where they've evolved. They evolved alongside the insects from that area. So the insects actually recognize native plants as food, and which in turn feed the wildlife. And native plants serve as important host plants for numerous insects, including those which can only eat specific plants. We call those insect specialists. One iconic example of a specialist plant is monarch butterflies. Most of us know the monarch butterfly and how its caterpillars can only eat milkweed. So a non-native or an exotic plant is a species that originated somewhere other than its current location. So it could be also referred to as exotic, alien, or introduced. And insects generally don't recognize these plants as food. You may as well add a plastic or fake plant in your garden if you expect it to be a part of its ecosystem. They just didn't evolve with it. Their digestive systems didn't evolve to be able to process it, to digest introduced plants, so they don't recognize it as food. And largely a lot of these non-native plants have been introduced by human activity. So another term that you may have heard thrown around is naturalized. So what naturalized refers to is a non-native species which grows successfully in its new area without human aid. They can be a neutral or positive contributor to their new environment, or the opposite by taking resources away from native species. Many plants we refer to as wildflowers along the roadsides are introduced plants which came from another country or continent, which have naturalized and done very well here. The one on the top, that's a bit of a brighter blue in that picture than they really are, but this is a plant called chicory, and we see this all along the roadsides here in Ottawa. I moved from the Durham region a couple of years ago. Same thing, we would see it all along the roadsides there, but did not originate in North America. It came over from Europe, most likely with the early settlers and colonizers. And same thing, whoops, sorry, with the one on the bottom, oxeye daisy, that has also naturalized here because it's been part of the space for hundreds of years now. A lot of people just assume that they're native plants, but they're actually not. So this is a term that you may or may not have heard. It's a little bit more colloquial. The term is called nativar, and what that refers to is a cultivated plant bred from a native species. So in other words, a native cultivar. So what would happen? A breeder would breed a plant for very specific qualities, for example, a shorter height or more vibrant colors. In this example right here on the top, let's see my cursor, on the top, the blue, that is our native plant false indigo, Baptisia australis. But the one below in yellow, that was bred that way. It was bred to be shorter, a different color. And with these native cultivated nativars, you'll usually see that it has a very specific name in quotes or a registered trademark from the breeder. If you buy anything from, let's say, Proven Winners, they've got a lot of really wonderful plants, but they always have new additions. They will always be cultivars. And a nativar would be cultivated from a native. And just to show you another popular one, and you can just see by the tag, if you're going out to the garden centers and you're looking for native plants, if it has like a very specific name, especially if it's referring to color or a new variety, chances are it's not a native, it's been cultivated and bred. So this one in particular, so echinacea, we do have a native echinacea or a purple coneflower that is native to Ontario. This particular one, Ruby Giant, is not a native. Hopefully that explains that. And yeah, I think I might, I'm trying to think if I have examples of more of them later on. But so basically when you're going into garden centers, like you can find a lot of native plants in garden centers, but you just have to look really carefully at the tags. So the last term that I'll cover is invasive. And invasive species are plants, animals, and microorganisms that are found outside of their natural range and whose presence poses a threat to either environmental health, the economy, or society. And that's a direct quote from the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. And non-native species that are also invasive are successful because they aggressively colonize an area. They crowd out native species. Even non-native species that are not invasive still displace a native species that could be there. And that I had taken from the article on biodiversity in the Carp Hills. So one of the resources that I did put at the bottom when we finish up is the website for Friends of the Carp Hills. You'll find a lot of other information there that you might find really interesting. So just to give you one example of an invasive plant that we're seeing a lot of in Ontario, the one on the right is called Phragmites. It's a very stately plant, very tall plant. It could be considered a very beautiful plant, but part of the issue is that it has taken over the habitat of our native cattail, which does support wildlife. So this is a picture right here. This is actually of my street, and this is last winter. And it is a picture of Phragmites and cattails, but it's a really, really great example of how one plant can take over another. So you can see the tops of the Phragmites plants, these feathery grass heads, seed heads. But down here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, about halfway down, you'll see the little brown tails of cattails. So the Phragmites is actually double the size, and it's definitely easier for it to just muscle out a native plant that easy. Another really common invasive plants, a plant or a shrub called common buckthorn. You'll see quite a bit in Ontario as well. And it is very aggressive. It produces tons of berries. Birds do love them, so it actually is feeding the birds, but the birds are then pooping out the seeds far from the mother plant. So it is a very successful invasive plant in that it's spreading quite rapidly. And I can't talk about buckthorn without sharing this particular tool with you. If you have ever tried to remove seedlings that are well rooted, that are at least a foot high, maybe 2 feet high, you'll know how difficult that is. This is a tool that I came across. It's actually made in Canada. It's made in BC by a small business, and it's called the Extractigator. I checked online and they have a couple of different sizes now. So this one, I encouraged this homeowner to purchase because we were rejuvenating a garden. They had just bought this house. It had been left unkempt for a long time, and a lot of buckthorn seeds had got in there, got really established. And we are changing it from what it is now to a largely native planting. But the Extractigator that the homeowner got and we were able to use was really successful in removing a lot of these really well-rooted buckthorn seedlings. Time check. So if we want to garden in partnership with nature, where do we start? So I'll give you some things to consider. You're gardening for wildlife, you definitely want to consider food. So what is going to be their food? Sometimes it's leaves of trees, of perennials, of shrubs. It could be pollen for the bees. It could be nectar for butterflies. It could be seeds, nuts. It could be other insects that are going to in turn feed birds. You definitely want to have a source of water. You want to have a source of shelter. Eliminate any pesticides. Because they're not just going to kill what you consider a pest, they're going to kill the predators of pests. And I'll touch on that really briefly in a few slides. You have to create a habitat, something where it wants to live and have everything that it needs to thrive. One of the specific things you can do is reduce the amount of fall cleanup, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. Leave the seed heads of native plants. They will feed many critters over the winter. We want to remove invasive plants and in their place, plant native plants. So some of the benefits of gardening with nature, we reduce the negative impact of the environment on the environment and its inhabitants. It creates an environment that will support native insects and other wildlife. It'll attract beneficial insects, both pollinators and predators. Gardening with wildlife will reduce the spread of invasive plants. You get to experience more wildlife, and you can enjoy becoming a more lazy gardener. That's one of my favorite. And you get to have birds visit your garden and eat the seeds naturally. You don't even need to spend money on bird food. And this has to be my absolute favorite benefit of gardening with nature. So every picture that you see here has my grandson's hand. I think one of the pictures has my grandson's butt, my other grandson. But my gosh, kids and critters. Before we teach kids to be afraid of things like bats and frogs and bugs and spiders, they are genuinely naturally curious. And all of these pictures right here were taken literally within 2 months. So tree frogs, turtles, salamanders, katydids. Now my grandsons happen to be on a space that has all the components to encourage all of these critters, but it's just really, really amazing to see young people get involved and care about nature. So I mentioned I was going to touch on some other types of insects. So let's talk about beneficial insects in general. So an insect which performs a beneficial activity to our gardens and then to the environment of a whole, is a beneficial insect. It could also be a source of food for many animals, such as birds, bats, fish, frogs. They can provide valuable products for us in the form of honey, beeswax, even silk from silk moths. And they are also vital pollinators, essential to most of our food crops, flowers, and other plants. And many insects are actually important predators of pests in our garden and keeps their numbers in check. Really quick example of that, you may have heard of ladybugs as being friends in the garden. The picture on the left over here this is a juvenile ladybug. The first time I ever saw one, I wondered what this little monster was that was eating our plants. Then I discovered that they are friends. They are baby ladybugs. And this picture I took at a lady's garden when I was doing a consultation for her. And she said the same thing. She said, I have this ugly pest which is making my plant sick. And I said, no, it's the aphids, the baby aphids that are making your plant sick. The ladybug is eating about 50 of them a day. So they are very friendly. And even as adults as well, this is one that's eating mealybug. So they're doing their job. So not only predators, but we also have a lot of parasitic insects. This is an example of the eggs being laid on a caterpillar by a parasitic wasp. And again, I think it looks like a tomato plant. That might be a tomato hornworm. Yeah, if you do all the things to attract and foster these insects, they will keep the balance. They know what to do. And of course, the other beneficial type of insect is a pollinator. I know the hummingbird's not an insect, but it's a great pollinator, so I thought I would include him. So native plants do check off many boxes as well for low maintenance gardens. And I hear that all the time from people. They want to have no maintenance gardens. Well, we can get it down and reduce the workload. So we know that they supply food for insects, which in turn feed wildlife. Because they evolved here, they're well suited to the climate and the soil type. So many actually happen to be drought resistant. You save water. And they play an important role in balanced ecosystem. And there's no need for insecticides because they will attract all the natural enemies of your pests. So now I want to get into just talking about some specific examples. Some great native plants. I really had to reduce this quite a bit because there are so many, and I'll share some of my favorite with you. And I'm always trying to find replacements for ornamental plants that I've been using for decades. So I'll share some of the ones that I really like. So goldenrod, the reason why I put that up first is because it may be one of the best to attract a large biodiversity to your garden. There are actually well over 100 different native species of goldenrod, and they are a very important source of pollen and nectar later in the summer when other plants have stopped flowering. Wildlife experts suggest that it may be our single most valuable perennial pollinator. The previous one, I believe that was a late goldenrod. It gets very tall and very bushy, flowers really late in the season, but one of the other 100 native varieties is this little guy. And this might be my favorite one. I love the color of it. It's just a very pretty lemony yellow. It's short, and it can grow really well in the shade. And that's been a challenge for a lot of gardeners, is to find plants that thrive in the shade, and especially dry shade. So this is a great one, and so I wanted to share that. Any pictures that I have here that have the plant tags, chances are I took those pictures at the Fletcher Wildlife Garden. If you have not been and this topic interests you, I would recommend that you go. Another really great perennial native plant is wild bergamot. There's actually 2 wild monardas that I will share with you. So the botanical name is Monarda fruticulosa. I like common names better. I've worked largely with the general public, so I don't always get to practice my my scientific names. But this guy right here is a great source of nectar for hummingbirds, bees, butterflies. Just like some other plants, it can be prone to powdery mildew. So this mildew that kind of covers the leaves. But one of the things that you can do in that case is just add a little bit of a shorter plant in front of it that will cover those lower leaves that sometimes die off closer to the end of the summer as things get really humid. The other variety that I wanted to share with you is scarlet bee balm, scarlet monarda. Butterflies absolutely love the red. Hummingbirds, butterflies do too, but hummingbirds are really attracted to red, and they love the tubular flowers. If you have this in your garden, you will notice it, because every time you brush by it, you'll be able to smell it. It's extremely fragrant. And both of these are in members of the mint family. Joe pieweed is a very, very stately plant, is a great source of nectar for bees, beneficial wasps, and butterflies. Has a really long bloom time of 2 months, and it reaches up to 6 feet tall. So if you have an area, maybe you don't have a garden, maybe you have a large type of rural space, adding this close to the ditches would be a great place to benefit from that height. And I think most of us, if you've been gardening for a while, you know black-eyed Susans. The native variety is Rebeckia hirta, and it's a host plant for 14 species of butterflies and moths, and a really great source of seeds in winter for birds and small, excuse my typo, mammals. I actually had, for the first time, I had juncos feeding on this, I noticed just before we had a snowfall, and they were just devouring all the seeds in my backspace. Another gorgeous plant, another very stately, very tall plant, Jerusalem artichoke. It is one of the native varieties of helianthus, or wild sunflowers. And leaves of one wild sunflower support 73 species of caterpillars from July till frost. Again, a very important time for our pollinators and caterpillars to find food. 97% of birds need insects to feed their young. So it's a really important plant to help host those caterpillars, so the birds can feed their young and set up a spot to make their nests and rear their babies. Oh, songbirds, another note, songbirds eat the seeds during the winter as well if you leave them up and don't cut them down. And it's actually a native perennial vegetable. This gives you a better idea of the scale of Jerusalem artichokes. And on the right-hand side, that is a picture of the tubers that you could harvest and process to eat. This is a picture that I opened with on my first slide, and it is a picture of a purple coneflower. Our native purple coneflower is Echinacea purpurea. Thank you for bearing with me with that. So our host Janet had actually taken this picture in her garden, and I think it's just absolutely lovely. And you know, they are a butterfly magnet. New England aster, another amazing source of pollen and nectar later in the season. And there are actually 52 varieties of asters native to Canada. And this is a picture I took out by the front of the house, closer to the road. And as I was walking to get the mail one day, I saw this little yellow that I didn't think belonged there, a little piece of yellow there. And I thought, oh, what is that? So I had to take a closer look, and it is this awesome little golden rod crab spider. And, you know, we talk about predators. I didn't even mention spiders and how great they are at keeping our pests down, but just fascinating. Another great plant in our gardens, lance leaf tick seed. I do use a lot of other tick seed in my garden designs. It's usually a really tidy, well-behaved plant. I'll be using the native variety a lot more now that I know more about it. And it's very drought tolerant, it's deer resistant, and it's one of those short and tidy plants which self-seed readily. So it's a great plant if you want to expand your space. And of course, milkweed. Very fragrant flower. If you haven't ever smelled it before, it's a really pretty fragrance. Self-seeds quite regularly, and the adult butterflies will drink the nectar, and of course the caterpillars will eat the leaves. And a lot of people don't realize that there are actually quite a few different kinds of milkweeds out there. This particular one, I was really happy that my suppliers started getting it in. So I have a source for butterfly weed if you need it, but another great plant for gardens, for dry spaces. And again, it's a butterfly magnet, and our caterpillars, our monarch caterpillars, really love to eat the leaves. And but they will leave the plant living. They won't decimate it. Some invasive insects will. Another great plant perennial for the hummingbirds is our native cardinal flower. And again, one of the pictures I had taken from the Fletcher Wildlife Garden. And even ground covers. So many of us know the perennial ground cover periwinkle, and that was our go-to plant for quite a few decades, actually, for many different reasons. We just know it to be a successful ground cover, but it actually is a very successful ground cover in the forest as well, and has been taking over for our native plants that should be there. So there are even native ground covers that we can use in areas where we would really like to keep a nice mass in a shaded space. On the left is wild ginger, and the roots actually do smell like ginger. If you ever work with it, you'll find that. And on the right-hand side is alpine strawberry. The strawberries themselves here in Ontario, they don't really grow to much significance for us, but they do produce strawberries that chipmunks and squirrels absolutely love. So I'll move on from perennials, and I'm not going to share a lot of examples of shrubs and trees, but I just do have a couple of favorites to share with you. And this one is a serviceberry. It's a very valuable host for a wide variety of wildlife. Their early flowers are an important source of nectar and pollen, and it can be used as a large shrub or small tree in the landscape, and it offers just gorgeous fall color. And it has sweet edible berries, which is a favorite of so many birds. If any of you have walked along the Carp Barrens Trail, you'll recognize this location. It's a picture I took in the spring when these guys were in flower, and it's just a little ways in on the trail, very close to the Beaver Dam, if you know that area. And if you don't know that area, I'm sure you'll want to go after seeing some of these pictures. So this is the fruit of the serviceberry. I've actually never seen them quite so large here in Ontario. I'm from the East Coast in Newfoundland. I got home in August, and as I walked through, the blueberries were completely in bloom, and all of the serviceberry bushes were just completely laden with these heavy, heavy fruit, and you could just walk along and pick them and eat them. Birds love them, we love them, but I do find on the East Coast some of these things, just because of the extra moisture in the air and in the soil, really helps berry plants really fill up quite a lot. The other shrub I'm going to mention, because I think it's really showy and really, really lovely, is our own native holly. This is called winterberry. This is another picture that I'd taken in the Carp Hills just before the snow came on in winter. So it is Ilex verticulata, and it's Ontario's native holly. And it's a great source of winter food for over 40 species of birds. So it's one of those things that I will also be planting a lot more of this with my clients' gardens, because I know a lot of people as well who like to make winter arrangements. And it's nice to see that when it's sold at garden centers, where people can get it as opposed to going out into the bush, because we really want to leave those berries for the wildlife. So if it's something that you like, plant it on your property, and then that way you can get your own trimmings to add to your winter planters. And last plant I'll talk about, if you want to plant something and you don't want to garden, or you don't want to be bothered with learning all of this extra information, then plant an oak. According to Dr. Talamy, oaks support over 500 species of moths and butterflies, and that includes their caterpillars. And more than that, it supports even many more birds and small mammals. So I'll get into some specific things, other things that we can do to support a biodiverse space. Creating brush piles, such an easy thing. If you're doing a cleanup in the spring or in the fall, and you've got leaves and branches and twigs that have fallen, just collect them all together. It's a great source of shelter for insects and small animals during the growing season, but it's also perfect overwintering location as well. And over time, these piles will break down naturally, adding to the organic matter in a space, including attracting beneficial fungi and microorganisms to help break it down. Another very specific thing that you can do if you have a garden is refrain from cutting perennials in the fall. There are actually probably hundreds of species of native bees, which are solitary bees, which mean they don't live in a hive in a communal setting, but over the winter they will go off on their own and find overwintering spots. And perennial stems that are hollow like this, and I think this was a clump of black-eyed Susan from one of my gardens. You can see the hollowness in the top. So these tiny little solitary native bees will actually climb into the top of those, or they'll actually even just burrow right through the stem to overwinter in spots like that. And allowing leaf litter to remain as well. One of the things, if you have a tree, like, you definitely don't want to leave the leaves all over the lawn. That'll just cause you grief and issues later for your lawn. But you could collect them and rake them directly under the tree. And even as you see on the right picture, that is a photo of a couple of white pines, which also shed their needles about twice a year. And in this case, what we just did is we outlined a bed to keep it nice and tidy looking, and just raked all the needles right into there, right under the tree. So it'll do a couple of different things. If you have a garden with plants and you collect the leaves there, it'll act as a great winter covering for them. This year, we may have lost quite a few perennials because January was such a record cold January here in Ottawa, and we didn't have a good snow cover. So if you find that that's the case in your space, then collect leaves and use those around your perennials. So that way, if we have a dry or extra cold winter, it does help to protect them. And like I said, you can keep it really tidy if you have a space under a tree, which is always really tricky to grow plants in, you can actually just grow some spring bulbs, some spring ephemerals in there, and they love that type of leaf litter to grow in. And the other thing that grows in leaf litter are actually some of our biggest, most beautiful giant silk moths. So the top one here, this is a Cecropia moth. I was probably just about 21 years old the first time I saw one. I was working in a garden center. Somebody brought me in this thing and went, what the heck is this? And then of course I had to look it up in a book, found out that it was the caterpillar of our giant Cecropia moth. And the one at the bottom is another gorgeous moth native to Ontario. That's our Luna moth. It as well is quite large, but the Cecropia, I believe, is the biggest one. So what happens with these guys, the caterpillars eat through the leaves on many different kinds of native trees. And as they get close to winter, they will form a chrysalis. They'll actually drop down to the ground, and within that leaf litter is where they overwinter. So if you're really clean in the fall and you collect all that leaf litter and put it in bags, you could be throwing away a lot of these gorgeous creatures. Another very specific thing that you can do to encourage wildlife is and benefit yourself to reduce work in the garden is cover the soil with plants and create large drifts or swaths of native plants. This is how they would kind of grow fairly naturally. If you add two different kinds together, like these purple asters and the yellow goldenrod, they actually support each other. One is usually taller than the other. I've had a lot of people tell me they don't really think of goldenrod as a plant in their space because they fall over, but that's probably most likely because it doesn't have a companion with it to keep it up. So the other thing that this will do as well, if you cover the soil, then it doesn't give a chance to have weed seeds from invasive plants blow into exposed soil and germinate. So, and it takes probably about 3 years. If you are changing your space over to, from grass to a garden of perennials, or from ornamental perennials to native, it probably takes about 3 years to get it nice and thick to where you don't have to do as much effort, but this will also help prevent moisture from evaporating, and again, perfect cover and shelter for some wildlife as well. One of the other things that I just want to touch on really briefly, because I talked to these guys within the past couple of weeks, is I wanted to tell you about a program from the Canadian Wildlife Federation. And for quite some time now, they've had a program where you can have your space certified as a wildlife friendly habitat. And I spoke to them a little while ago, and I'm actually going to be certifying some of my gardens, my clients' gardens, as a wildlife friendly habitat, which I'm really, really excited about. And they're actually changing their criteria to include a spot for landscapers and designers. So it's a really great resource for us. So I mentioned different kinds of invasive plants. Where you can find out more is the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. They have this really great resource called Grow Me Instead Guide, especially for those of us who've been gardening for a long time. We know certain go-to plants, and if now we're learning they're a problem plant that take over our forests and wild spaces. They are suggesting alternatives. So let's say, for example, I just show you one example here. Periwinkle is an invasive species and a bothersome plant for our wild spaces. So what you can grow instead is alpine strawberries. It likes the same kinds of conditions. It has basically the same growth habit. So that is definitely one of the resources if you would like to learn more. It's a really, really great tab on their website. And as well, I get asked a lot where to buy native plants. As I mentioned earlier, the industry is not going to be able to keep up with the demand, that's for sure. But there are definitely a couple of places that specialize in native plants that you can go to. So local garden centers, as I mentioned before, just check the tags and make sure that they're native. But I see native plants at every garden center that I go to, especially like the independent garden centers like Richie's, Knipples, Artistic, those guys out in the West End. We've got 2 Richies here as well, and Make It Green and a couple of others. They all have native plants, and the staff that are there, the staff have they're generally full-time. I mean, they hire up in the springtime and hire some seasonal people, but there are always very knowledgeable staff who will be able to educate you and tell you which plants are native if you're struggling with that. The Fletcher Wildlife Garden that I mentioned before on Prince of Wales Drive, I guess, just as one of the part of the experimental farm. Normally they have a native plant sale in the spring, and we'll include their website as well. For online, there's Ontario Native Plants. I've talked to a couple of people who have ordered from those guys over the past year and have been fairly happy and satisfied with what they've received. Beaux-Arbres in Bristol, Quebec, Ferguson Tree Nursery in Kentville. Last year, they actually started adding perennials as well. Connaught Nurseries in Cobden, and a newer one on the scene is Anthea Gardens. They are also an online nursery. They're kind of southeast, past Castleman, not quite towards, not quite as far as like Kingston and Smith Falls, those area. But I began ordering some plants from them as well. So they are just starting to work wholesale with landscapers, and I've gotten some great plants from them as a test that were beautiful native plants. I've gotten some winterberry from them and some hemlock, and they were just really gorgeous. Other resources. So we've got places like Friends of the Carp Hills, as I've mentioned, Ottawa Fields Naturalist Club. I was recently introduced by Janet to the McNamara Field Naturalist Club. A lot of these clubs, you know, they're probably only about $20 a year to join, and I learn a ton from these organizations. And one thing that I love that they do is that for members, they will also organize hikes where you might be able to join a biologist or an entomologist to on an interpretive hike to show you all of these things as you walk through the woods. Canadian Wildlife Foundation, as I've mentioned before, and I think I mentioned as well the Ottawa Wildflower Seed Library. They set up a couple of different spots in Ottawa last year to give away free native seeds and seedlings. So follow that's their website, but if you follow them on their Facebook page, you'll see all of that. Doug Talamy, as I mentioned. Barrett Erickson is a lady who kind of works, she's in the center of the city, and she's been doing a lot of work with Boulevard Pollinator Gardens, and she's got a great blog, great website where you can follow her and some information that she has to share. Sean James is a horticultural professional designer, and he's based out of the west end of the GTA, and he's another one that I have followed because he's really carving the path for a lot of native gardens in the industry, which is awesome. Extractor link, it's right there. If you're looking for more information on what you can do and certifications you can get, David Suzuki Foundation also has a Butterfly Way project that you can get involved with. The wildlife friendly certification from Canadian Wildlife Federation that I mentioned. They're actually offering a free course this year as well. Registration just ended, but I've started taking it because, I mean, you can always learn as much as you can, right? It's turning out to be a great course if you know of anybody who would like to take that next year. And the last couple that I have here, in the UK, there's also Mary Reynolds, who has been sharing this kind of information for quite a while. And her current project is We Are the Ark, to encourage more native gardens. And there's a link for the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. these are two of the books that I mentioned from Doug Tallamy. He's got a third and maybe a fourth as well. These were mind-blowing books for me, and I've read a lot of books, so I would highly recommend them. And I do have another poll for you. So like I said, I kind of sped through that last little bit because I just definitely want to give you guys time for questions if you have any. But I'll be tweaking this presentation. I'll be offering a similar one in person at the Cottage Life and Backyard Show at the end of April. And I'd love it if you just let me know how I can do better. Would you be looking for more information on specific plants that you can incorporate into your space, or host plants for specific insects, more info on beneficial insects? Let me know what you think. Bear with me, I'm trying to advance the slide and it's not working.
Oh, it's just because the poll is still running, Lana.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
I can actually display the poll as soon as people have finished in just a couple of minutes or a couple seconds.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
So yeah, I really appreciate that. And the last slide that I'm going to share with you is just my contact information again. So if there's anything that you think people would be interested in, or if there are questions that you did not get a chance to ask tonight, please send me an email. I would love to hear from you if you have anything that you feel I could add to these presentations.
Should be good to go now.
Okay. There we go. So please connect with me if you think I can help you in your desire to garden in a more environmentally friendly way, or if you know anybody else who would. And this helps, this quote really helps me sometimes. I get a little overwhelmed by the amount of things that could be done, that we should do for the environment, for climate change, just to do things in a better way. But I always think of this quote from Maya Angelou, where it is, do the best you can until you know better. When you know better, do better. And because, but I have sold probably truckloads of pesticides in my lifetime. I am knowing better and I am doing better, and that helps me. So my last thought for you is that if I can do it, anyone can. I take a great deal of security and confidence in knowing my go-to plants that I've used for decades. When it comes to a shady garden, I know that if I put a couple of different hydrangeas and a couple of boxwood and some creeping periwinkle, I know that that's going to work. But I'm trying not to use those plants anymore. Well, I'm not using those plants anymore, but so learning how to do this in a different way has been a learning curve, but for me, it's been an exciting learning curve. I've really, really enjoyed learning a different way, because I always thought there was a better way, and now the rest of the world has kind of caught up. So again, thank you for Friends of the Carp Hills for giving me this platform, and I am happy to stay for a little bit if anybody has any questions. Hopefully I can answer for you.
All right, I've been tracking the questions, and again, if you could put your question into chat, and Lana has asked me to read the questions to take that burden off her, trying to find them. So
thank you, I appreciate it.
That's right. So you gave the name of the bird feeder mix, which I think was the Songbird mix.
Songbird mix.
Yeah, and who was that from? Do you know the supplier?
I got it at Richie's Feed and Seed here in Carp. So I don't know. It might be their own brand, but I'm not sure, but it was from Richie's.
Okay, that's great. All right, so we have one from Lynn, who's a fan of the Tallamy books, and she says, I want to plant a complete native garden in my Ottawa backyard. Unfortunately, the area was invaded by Japanese knotweed, which is allelopathic, which means it discourages other plants from growing there. And this was all dug out, and the area is now under a heavy tarp. Do I need to do remediate the soil before planting any native species?
It certainly is. It's not going to, it's certainly not going to hurt, but if you can add compost, if you have any leaves that you can add to that space once you're ready to start planting into it, the knotweed is actually going to decompose, and that's going to add to the value of the soil. Like, I don't know how long it takes for knotweed to solarize, if that's what you're doing, but it probably takes some time, and you may want to continue to watch for it. But no, I would definitely add some compost. That's certainly going to help.
All right, question from Bernard. I think you sort of answered this in your presentation. Do you recommend to not cut down the flowering plants for the winter months?
Yeah, so I think you're probably satisfied with that as we went through. It's something that in the horticultural industry, many of us, especially in landscape maintenance, have been doing. Like, we just leave everything clean and cut everything down to minimize the work in the spring, because we seem to have enough work to do in the spring, and it just leaves things kind of clean. But no, we are definitely looking at a different way and different benefits of leaving them up. There are a lot that can provide some really nice winter interest as well, especially when it comes to some of the native grasses and some of the flowers like purple coneflower and black-eyed Susans that have seeds that our birds will eat. And as well, the other thing that leaving perennials standing over the winter will do, it's a great place for leaves to collect and snow to collect. So it actually adds to a nice snow barrier blanket to help prevent them from drying over the winter. So it's a good winter protection as well.
All right, and so again, the question following from that is that, do you ever then cut the flowering plants down? I guess the question would be is do you do it in the spring? And if you don't, is it just that the new growth naturally covers the old remains?
So it depends on what kind of aesthetic you're looking for in your garden. You can definitely, if you just want to leave the stems to decompose in the spring, you can just break those stems and let them fall where they may, and they'll just decompose. If let's see, finish. What was the last part of that question?
I think she was asking if you leave it there, does the new growth just naturally cover whatever you've left there?
Absolutely, in no time, usually by about June, depending on what kind of a plant it is. But you may just have to break it and drop it in place.
Great. And then the next question is from Charlene. How would you recommend removing established buckthorns? And are all buckthorn species invasive and non-native?
I'll be honest, I'm only familiar with the common buckthorn, which is invasive and not from our area. So I really don't know if we have any native varieties.
We do, actually.
Okay,
There's one. Yeah, there is one, but it's very uncommon.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you already have it established, I guess it depends on how big. If it is like a tree where it's like 8 feet and up, it's probably producing a ton of fruit, which is a ton of seeds. Those really should be cut down, and the root, you probably need to use an axe to cut them out. Other than that, if they're smaller, if it's in an area where there aren't too many other competing roots and you can get a shovel in the ground if they're small enough, that's sometimes enough to get them out. But if it's a little more tricky and they're very well rooted, that tool that I mentioned, the extractigator, should help.
Yeah, and I can say I did buy an extractigator on your recommendation, and I was able to lever out, I would say, 1-inch diameter buckthorns. It was a full body workout, but very satisfying.
It is, and it is. Yes, I have to agree. If for any saplings that you're removing, and even if you're weeding, honestly, the best time to do it is when after a good rain. It makes a really big difference when you're trying to pull out stubborn anything with roots.
Okay, and I will just add, because I know two people have done this for really large buckthorn. They have cut the buckthorn in the summer when it is still growing, and then painted the stumps with glyphosate.
Yeah.
That's what I've heard, and they've been very successful killing it that way, which
Yeah.
it is still a pesticide, but at least it's limited to the stump.
Yeah, it's very targeted. I know, like Roundup glyphosate is such a bad word right now, but there are instances like this where it's very targeted, and yeah, it can really help you out in those cases.
All right, and then just so people know, I've posted in the chat the links that Lana has shown, so you'll see all those. Okay, so our next question is, or next comment is from Hugh Metcalf, and he says, New Jersey tea is a native plant and in the buckthorn family. It says it's a small 2 to 3 foot shrub that does well in drier soils, in sun and apart shade.
Awesome. Thanks you for adding that. For those of you who hadn't seen any of Hugh's presentations, he specializes as well in gardening for the birds and other native plants. Really big resource. So I really appreciate you attending, and thanks for adding that.
All right, and we've had another thank you. And then from Monica, what is good for full sun clay soil that gets waterlogged at times and dry other times? We planted milkweed last summer, which likes it, but I am looking for other types to fill in.
Okay, yeah, and that is definitely a unique condition where it stays waterlogged. There's a lot of plants who don't like their feet wet, especially perennials. I believe, and Hugh, you can chime in on this if you can think of any that I don't include, but if you're thinking perennials, swamp milkweed should do okay. So there's a couple of different varieties of milkweed, not just the common milkweed that we usually see. They can take wet feet. Cardinal flower, I believe it can as well for a period of time. So the cardinal flower,
you know, she said it gets dry. It alternates between wet and then dry, so that makes it really challenging.
Yes, it does. And if you are looking for options in the way of small bushes, willows, cedars, dogwood, would all do well in those conditions, the wet and the dry.
All right. Another thank you from someone. And then would you be able to suggest any resources for use of native plants in urban landscaping design, and also how to incorporate into a cutting garden?
So just so I'm clear, so you're looking to design a space yourself?
It says, would you be able to suggest, any resources for use of native plants in urban landscaping design? And she says, yes, she wants to design it herself.
There's actually quite a few. One of the resources that I've given you as well is the Canadian Wildlife Foundation. So if you go on their website, they have a complete space just for examples of different types of native plants to use. They actually have samples of their display gardens that they have in Canada. If you're local, drive out and check them out in the summer. Fletcher Wildlife Garden as well. Great examples of established gardens. And as well, I mentioned the Ottawa Wildflower Seed Library. If you go on, I don't know about their website, but definitely on their Facebook page, if you search native plant designs, there have been posts on there with very specific examples of designs that you should be able to follow. And if you don't find anything through there, send me an email and I'll find something else for you off the top of my head. And then the part about cut flower gardens, like if you are doing a garden space and you are adding, and you want it to be a native garden, you can add cut flowers into that. Nothing says that it has to be 100% native. if there's a large percentage of natives, then you're doing a great job to support wildlife and help nature and biodiversity. But there are definitely flowers that you can add into there, and you just have to manage it maybe a little bit of a different way. Like if you add dahlias or different kinds of perennials. So it depends on specifically what types of plants that you're looking to add. But you could even have like a cutting garden and then border it with some of these native plants.
All right, and then and it kind of answers her next question, which is, she said, I sometimes see some of the pollinators still visiting my annual plants like zinnias. Should one still aim to go 100% native versus mixed use planting?
I'm not, and I wouldn't recommend it. If you love your zinnias, then don't. This is and annuals can take on a different role as well. If you are changing a garden and you are starting to plant native plants, you're going to have some soil space. So the perfect thing to add in that space in between plants until they're established is annuals. And you've already know that there are annual flowers such as zinnias that are really wonderful pollinators, and butterflies and bees and hummingbirds as well really love them, and they do produce a lot of nectar. So I would definitely add them. Do what makes you happy. It's your garden. And I love my flowers. And like I mentioned earlier, you know, this has been quite a learning curve for me, but no, I'm also going to keep the things that I love. I actually love roses. They're divas in the garden, but I will spend extra time and care to have a couple of roses, to have some zinnias, to have some other plants that I really love. But yeah, if you have, I think they say if it's probably about 75% native, that is doing a really, really great job for our wildlife. So balance the rest out with other things that you love. The one thing for me that I have made a commitment to completely stay away from is obviously invasive plants. And I'm, like I said, learning as to what other replacements I can use. Hopefully that answers your question. That's my opinion.
All right, and then Hugh has added the question for Monica on the kind of dry, wet places that wild bergamot will do well there, as well as Joe Pyeweed, or sorry, wild bergamot will do well there, but Joe Pyeweed, swamp milkweed, or cardinal flower need constant moisture. So you would have to mulch to hold that spring moisture in.
Awesome, thank you so much, Hugh.
All right, I think there's a whole bunch of thank yous and people being inspired, Lana, like that will keep all the chats information for you. So I don't see any more new questions coming in. So I'm just going to end the recording.